Hello everyone, this is Professor Stanley, Louisiana State University, Alexandria, Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences. This class is Political Science 2051. We are in the fall of 2017. What I would like to go over with you today is some of the announcements and review items that some of you may have already seen. However, I do want to emphasize them again here in this presentation, as I do realize some of you are better at being verbal learners or listeners, and some of you are better at visual presentations as well. And there are others who are best with the reading. So my goal here is to give everyone a balanced approach in this course. And as far as the announcements go, again, you've already seen them. However, the goal is to emphasize them also and to review some of the items you may not have been familiar with at this point. After we go over these announcements, we will be looking at Chapter 11, which we now know is not Chapter 10. Thank you for some of the comments pointing that out. Unfortunately, the textbooks change annually, and the campaigning chapter is normally coupled with the media chapter. So for whatever reason, the publishers decided that that was no longer the case, that they wanted to do that. And that's okay. We'll take that and work with that. And I'm going to give everyone an extra day to complete their assignment. So if you were a little bit late on understanding the directions, that's okay. Some of you emailed me and pointed that out. So I will be extending some extra time on the deadline. So there's no reason to worry about that. After we go over this short bit of announcements here, we will again discuss Chapter 11 in the PowerPoint. My goal is to highlight some of the main points in the chapter. Again, as this is a distance learning class, it is very much a lot of student-led learning, so you do have to take the lead and understand some of this information without having too much interactions with me per se. However, that does not mean that I'm not available to discuss things with you and certainly talk about things of interest in the chapters and in the textbook or even in the real world today, currently. So just keep that in mind. So our announcements for today, October 20th, 2017, if you are going to withdraw, remember the last day to do that is November 3rd of this year. Again, I did talk about some of the reasons why you may feel like you need to withdraw, but it's always important to at least reach out to me if you're considering withdrawing from the course and you may not know where you're at in terms of your grade, or you missed some assignments. Again, this is about communication as much as it is about learning and being involved with gathering knowledge. So you have to communicate with me your situation, otherwise I won't have any idea what's going on, and therefore I can't afford you with any sort of grace period or mercy period on your assignments and the reasons why they're not turned in. And I've already afforded some of you with extra time due to life circumstances. However, that needs to be communicated. I did receive some good feedback from you all. I appreciate that. That is always great news as an educator and as someone in academia. So keep the positivity there. Also, any constructive feedback you have is welcomed, okay? It doesn't have to be positive. If you don't agree with something, you can feel free to reach out to me and tell me why. And I will document that. Again, you all will notice that my approach in this subject is not to indoctrinate you with my opinions or my beliefs about what political science is. It is to provide you with a balanced overview of the fundamentals of American government. And you will infer your own opinions and gather your own opinions as we move throughout the course. And I hope that's certainly something that you have been doing up to this point. Overall, the averages are a little bit higher than normal at this point in the semester. Generally, it's around 76. However, they are a little elevated. And of course, I have done some grading since I typed this, so it will be a little different than an 82%. However, there are still a lot of different ways that you can improve your grade and earn points. So remember, don't give up if you're not at where you're at or happy where you're at with your grade, because you have the ability to progress and put in the work, number one, and improve your grade. And that's, again, something we all do together. So if you're having difficulties, always be sure to contact me, and then we can make a plan of action on what to do. Again, for those of you that do complete your assignments, well, more so in the case of your discussions before Thursday, I'm able to get on here and give you more feedback before the deadline. So if you're waiting until the last minute, I understand you may have other obligations, but if you want feedback from me and if you want to get the most out of this course, especially for those of you who value feedback, I would definitely recommend getting those things in before the deadline. And again, those make us all accountable. If you looked at the quiz grades from the Constitution, you'll notice that your grade was a little bit different from what you originally received as your score. The reasoning and the logic behind that is there were one or two items that you all had difficulty with, and essentially what happens is I review the items that students have difficulties with, and I will confer that with other members of the faculty, and generally we will come up with a conclusion about what to do. And in this case, I just ultimately curved your grade 10 points. So in the future, what I will do is probably revise those items. There was maybe some confusion on the wording for some of you. Whatever the case is, those things will be revised. So we're going to go ahead and move forward into the discussion on Congress for this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, wherever you're at. This is a big chapter, and a lot of the reason behind my discussion on it here today is we have noted some of the more important chapters that you've seen me assess you on. Obviously, the Constitution is one. The other three I'm going to really get into with you is the Congress, the presidency, and the judicial system. Reasons for that, I want to get more into that, is because they are fundamental to your understanding of American government and the way things work today in the political world. So a lot of the other information that you've seen so far are basic introductions to what politics is in America. And this is different for those of you that took the 1001 course, perhaps with Dr. Ordaz or another one of our wonderful faculty members in the department. The emphasis in this course is how do things run here in America, So that's the difference. A lot of the stuff you probably have seen in the fundamentals class. However, those are fundamental to a from a systemic approach of how government works. This is fundamental to how American government works and how things are working today. So just keep that in mind as you are reading and learning throughout the course. Something interesting that you may have already noticed about your textbook and the design is the actual cover, and you all probably can see that it looks like your cell phone. And the reason for that, I guess, is the authors obviously want to appeal to the generation who is learning about this, and the majority of those would be younger generation, obviously college age, but there are others outside of that as well. I guess today as a whole, as a society, each one of us in different age groups are now more in touch with social media and our smartphones. So we're just more prone to pick up a smartphone and make that our daily routine, the first thing we do when we get up in the morning, instead of, I don't know, have some time to yourself, perhaps go for a run, meditate, whatever it is you like to do. So we are effectively being fed media and garbage 24 hours a day. But that's another discussion that I'll have to save for later. Our goals here today are to discuss Chapter 11 at Congress. And I'll try to be as brief as possible. However, there is a lot of information that needs to be discussed, such as, what does Congress actually do? Where does the power to do these things come from? When we talk about Congress, you need to remember it includes the House and the Senate. So there are two legislative branches that are included in the Congress, bicameral legislation. You would be surprised the number of adults that actually have no clue what the difference is between the House and the Senate. So we're going to talk about that today, and you're going to learn about that today. Implications of apportioning House seats. A lot of this we discussed a little earlier in the book. The reason for that is the population and the Electoral College. People get wrapped up on the fact that numbers are everything. Well, numbers are not everything, especially when it comes to everyone having an equal voice. And we learned this in the 2016 election. And some of the reasons behind Donald Trump's victory, we've talked about that. Described committee structure. Now, those of you, probably most of the majority of you probably don't get really excited about committees and how they work, but we need to talk about it anyway. Obviously, there's a chair for every committee. There's a leader within each committee, and this is how legislation is effectively debated and formed and ultimately signed into law. And I'll probably show you a nice little video clip either at the end or towards the end of this presentation to give you a better idea of what it is we're talking about. And what it is I was just saying, bicameral legislation, essentially there are four functions of Congress. Number one, we've discussed it already, bicameral legislation. Lawmaking function, lawmaking and earmarks. As you learned in the book, the process of understanding or establishing legal rules that govern society is lawmaking. Earmarks, those are things that are apportioned in legislation to fund projects, so special projects by these lawmaking people. And usually they are ultimately beneficial toward the district. Obviously, they would not be proposing them. Other essential functions. Representation. You have a congressperson that represents your district, and that makes you a part of this process indirectly. So, as an essential function of representative democracy, you are represented by the person you vote to represent you. Okay? Service to constituents, casework, ombudsperson. Those are some things that you need to look at in the book. Some of the definitions. I won't quote them verbatim. Oversight function. Oversight is given to Congress to follow up on things that they have passed or legislation that has already been passed. Now, the extent to which they do follow up on those things, that's debatable. A lot of the oversight functions do go to executive branches within the government. So the laws are passed by the legislative branches, and ultimately their incorporation and implementation is given to the executive branch most of the time. The public education function, agenda setting. Again, there are some different debates in the book. When we talk about public education, it is a very, controversial topic. So, for our intents and purposes here in this discussion, we're going to look at it as determining the priority of the direction of public education. Conflict resolution function. When there are issues that come up in Congress, generally they are brought on by the interest groups that we talked about. Congress tries to resolve the issues that are brought to them. But as you'll learn, most bills die in Congress ultimately. Okay, Pledge of Allegiance. This is just a picture in the book from newly naturalized citizens. The debate that's discussed here is, should all newly naturalized citizens say the Pledge of Allegiance? And that is a good question. All right, let's get to the actual meat and potatoes of this chapter. House, Senate differences, and congressional perks. Well, size and rules, Rules Committee, and the Hastert Rule, debate and filibustering, cloture, increased use of filibuster, reconciliation, and the nuclear option. Size and rules. House has 435 representatives. Okay. The Senate has 100. We've talked about some of the reasons behind that. Okay. And why they're important. Rules Committee. Basically, every debate or every issue that's brought before Congress, you have a timeline that is given by that committee that says, we're going to discuss this X amount of time, and that's it. That's all we're going to give to it. And of course, there are exceptions to the rule, especially depending on how important the legislation is at the time. The Hastert Rule came into play around the mid-90s. And Dennis Hastert was a Speaker of the House at that time. So he basically came up with the idea that a bill should not be brought to the floor unless it has the support of the majority of the majority. And some of you may be thinking, well, that is mostly common sense. However, from the viewpoint of the institution, it was not until this time. So basically, if a bill were to have been brought to the floor with only a partial majority of a party supporting it, then it would face more obstacles getting through the legislative process, as the majority of the members either do not understand the bill or do not support the bill. And you also have to consider the opposition political party, which will most of the time be opposing the rule. To make a long story short here, you have to have agreement within your own camp before you propose an idea to another camp. Okay? Debate and filibustering, some of the more interesting words here in this class. Cloture is, again, something that can be invoked by the Senate. The specific rules are in the book. 16 senators have to sign a petition on it, and after 2 days, 3/5 of the entire membership has to vote. The filibuster is basically getting up to the podium and talking for no good reason. A lot of people call it red herring or a stall, if you like, in sports. For example, when a kicker goes to kick the ball, the opposing team in American football may call a timeout, effectively stalling out the other team. That's basically what filibustering is. Okay, it's a stall tactic. Reconciliation applies to budget bills sent from the House of Representatives to the Senate. These bills are specific types of bills that are vital to the American public, the interest of the American public, so they cannot be filibustered. Okay, so there are ultimately some bills that cannot be touched by all these sort of funny laws and little establishment traditions within the United States Congress. The nuclear option is not nearly as bad as it sounds, okay? We already talked about cloture and taking 60 senators to invoke that. However, Senate rules can ultimately be changed to override something to a majority vote of 51 votes instead of a supermajority of 60 votes. And remember that a supermajority is different from a majority vote. Okay? Senator Marco Rubio, you see here in the picture, was a potential Republican candidate for the presidency in 2006. The book asks you some questions to get you thinking about how things would be different in terms of Senator Rubio's ethnicity and the impact that that would have on his political positions. So those are some things for you to think about as you're reading through the book. Congresspersons and the citizenry, a comparison. Let's see if there is, yes, as a chart. We're currently in the 115th Congress. If you take a look at the median or the averages, if you will, for those of you who are not proficient in statistics, the averages of the U.S. population versus those in the Senate. So basically, age-wise, most people are older that run for office or ultimately hold office currently. The percentage of minorities is also lower. The percentage of church and synagogue members Well, as you see, the House and the Senate also have a majority. That the Senate column should actually be on the religion row percentage number. That should be 88, as you see in the book. And it also breaks down religion in terms of denomination. Roman Catholic, Protestant is the majority denomination in Congress currently, followed by Roman Catholic and Jewish. Percentage female in the U.S., 50%. In the House, it's 19. In the Senate, it's 21. That number has actually increased substantially over the last decade. So the number of women in Congress has actually improved. Advanced degrees, generally 1 in 10 people in the country have an advanced degree, such as myself. However, in the House and in the Senate, you see another, well, I would call it a supermajority. If you compared it to the U.S. population, almost 3/4 of the Senate have an advanced degree, which is usually a legal degree. As you see, the next row, percentage lawyers employed as the primary occupation. U.S. population less than 1%, House almost 36%, and the Senate 54%. Percentage of families earning over $50,000 a year. U.S. around 45%, both the House and the Senate 100% over. Median net worth, percentage terms, 45,000 for the American public. And you see here again, the House has $860,000 average compared to a $2.9 million average in the Senate. So, think about it for a second. Does the Congress actually mirror the American public, the people who they are representing, or do they mirror some other group? Some other group that we don't know about because, well, obviously, compared to the U.S. population, they're nowhere near the same. The only numbers that I see even close here in this table, which is on page 297 in your book, the only numbers I see close are, let's all look together, the percentage of Roman Catholics, so that is relatively close reflection in the House and Senate versus the general public in the U.S., and the number of Jewish people. That is also sort of close. The rest of the numbers are disproportionately plotted, if you want to use another statistics term. So if you were to put this all on a graph, you would see a lot of disproportionate numbers. And there are a lot of reasons behind that. And some of those reasons you find in the book. What does it mean to be a congressperson? Perks and privileges? Permanent staffs. Number one, there are between 30 and 40,000 people employed on Capitol Hill as some sort of staff member. Roughly 50%, your book says. I would say probably more than that. Full, if you include people that aren't full-time. You also have congressional caucuses. These are other types of groups that have been formed to help guide certain specific strategies. For example, for your book called Special Interest, African Americans as well as the farmers or any types of other interest that would take a Democratic and a Republican political ideology, take on the form of that. Also, you have privileges under rule of law. Those are expressly listed in the Constitution that every one of you have already read. Republican candidate for U.S. President, Senator Marco Rubio. We talked about him already. And now we'll talk about Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is a Republican senator from Texas, along with a large list of candidates who ultimately ran for the primary election. We're around 16 or 17 people, if my memory serves correctly. Why do so many U.S. senators run for president? Because they're already in the system. They already know the way things work. They already made the connections. They've already established the network. And they already have a voting base to elect them. That's why people who are in the U.S. Senate run for president. Candidates for congressional elections. Let's take a look at who actually runs for Congress, right? Well, it takes a lot of money to run, doesn't it? We talked about that already. Okay? Presidential effect. Basically, if you're running on an election year, you're going to get more votes. I don't know how else to say that. That's pretty obviously dictated in the book there on page 299. Midterm elections, well, you don't get as much support, especially if you're running on the coattails of a presidential candidate. The powers of incumbency, also known as the powers that be. The people who are in power ultimately hold power and gain more power. That is essentially what is being said on page 300. Very simply put, and also people who are in office generally keep office, as you see with the Congresswoman from Ohio here in this picture. All right, the graphs we're looking at together here on page 301, you can see a small increase in the number of legislators who failed to be reelected in 2010. Why do you think that is? I'll leave that question for you to answer. And we've already answered here in our discussion as well. Okay? And a lot of things to consider that we didn't talk about, the book has not talked about. You have to remember 2008, 10, 9, 10 were generally considered some rebuilding years in the economy because of the large economic losses that Wall Street, I don't want to say caused, but were ultimately a part of when we had the housing collapse in 2008. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the housing collapse in 2008, I highly suggest that you do some research into that to give you an idea of where we're at economically here in this country and how we got to this point, especially within the last 10 years. And it was about 10 years ago that all of this started, actually. So that's some good homework for you to do. Take a look at that. Apportionment of the House and Senate. Well, excuse me, just the House of Representatives. There's been a lot of issues with reapportionment and redistricting. People basically draw their districts with the idea of how they're going to win the election and the next election in mind. So you're saying to yourself, well, this doesn't seem fair. That's because it's not. We call this term gerrymandering, and it's an interesting way how this this term ultimately came to be. It was spliced with two other terms. And I think there's a discussion in your book on that. You had a governor in Massachusetts in the 1812 elections. Elbridge Gerry did the same tactics to try to win his district. And the funny part is it looked like a salamander when you put it down on a piece of paper, for example. So smart people came up with the idea of gerrymandering. The word was actually created for that. So you learned something new today. Minority and majority districts basically mean what they say. Okay, there's not a whole lot that I can really add to that other than the fact that districts were drawn around minorities to win elections. And for what it's worth, you should take a look at the individuals who did this, who claim to be representing these people in the best way possible. However, they're drawing districts basically to win based on the idea of race alone. Also ethnicity as well. There's a good discussion on that in the book, as well as a picture of the district I was talking about with Governor Jerry in 1812 on page 302. Okay, so you really, and there it is right there. You really have to take in mind who these people are, why they're running for office, and what are their intentions. And you can clearly see, based on the examples given to you in the book about gerrymandering and minority majority districts, that a lot of politicians are interested only in winning the next election. Okay? So, in theory, or what we like to say ideally in academics and in political science, is that a district should be drawn objectively. What do I mean by that? It should be bipartisan in its nature, representing a large number of people based on not only party, I would argue, it just says party in the book, but also race, ethnicity, perhaps religious beliefs, income level, a lot of different things. So, example number two, unstable systems. All districts have the same number of supporters in each party. Okay, obviously, you want to win, so someone who doesn't want to win would want example two. That's why nonpartisan redistricting boards, who generally aren't running for office, would like example number two because they aren't running. And they have no interest in who wins the election, other than the fact that they can say that they did things in a neutral manner. Example three, classic partisan gerrymander. Obviously, those in the red, the party in the red, tends to win the election. The circles, red circles, will win because they have the numbers. Let's be honest here. How is Congress organized? We're going to go through this. Power of committees. Each committee has a different task to complete in Congress. Okay? So they have a different task to complete in Congress. There are different types of committees: standing, select, joint, conference, and House Rules Committee. And I apologize, there were some letters left off here. That should say joint committee. And there was also a number left off earlier. You can call publishers of the book and complain to them about it. The ones that you've been citing all semester long. How are committee members selected? How are they selected? Well, if there's more power in a committee, generally you have to have more time put in the system to be elected to that committee. So it's basically seniority. Leadership in the House, you have a speaker. Most people are familiar with Speaker of the House when you say that term because they saw it on the news, or maybe they learned about it in this class. The Majority Leader, which is whichever power is in party, there's a person that is leading the majority represented in the House, as well as another person that represents the minority as well, or the lower number of partisan members in the House of Representatives. Okay? So the book tells you about those things, and they go into a little bit more detail. A whip is someone who is at the right hand of the majority and minority leaders in Congress. So it could be an aide, it could be someone who is very high up in power, uh, a member of Congress, basically, someone that aids the majority leader and the minority leader in Congress. Basically, here's an updated look of those people who are representing us. Paul Ryan, very well-known House of Representatives Speaker, right now is a Republican from Wisconsin. Okay. Majority Leader McCarthy is in the center, also Republican, as well as Nancy Pelosi, who is a former House of Representatives Speaker, now is the Minority Leader in the House of Representatives. So that's a little bit about how the House of Representatives is organized. Now, remember, if you like to have more information on all of those things, you can always go to the book and check out each definition. Again, my goal here is to get you thinking and get you moving on these three important and influential chapters. Chapter 11, Chapter 12, and Chapter 14. We will not spend a lot of time on Chapter 13. As I probably mentioned to you all in the beginning of this course, the bureaucracy was not considered a major part of political science up until at least, well, let me back up. It was not published in the textbook and considered academically, recognized academically as influential as Congress, the president, and the court system until about 5-6 years ago, is when they started actually teaching it in the textbook. And I remember that because that's around the time that I came on board with the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences with Louisiana State. So that is, again, something that's outside of the scope of this discussion, but we'll talk more about that later. The Senate is organized a little differently than the House, as you all probably have noticed by now. Okay, there are a fewer number of positions. Generally, if you look at the comparison on page 309, you'll see that the House has an assistant minority leader. The Senate does not. Number of reasons behind that. Basically, the Senate, if you look at it in terms of just numbers, the Senate is smaller and therefore would require less organization from sheerly a numbers perspective. It's the same old idea of the chiefs and the Indians. Okay, you've heard the old saying, too many chiefs, not enough Indians. Well, basically, too many leaders and not enough people to lead. That's a good example when we talk about the differences between why there's a difference in the organization of the Senate versus the organization of the House of Representatives. And it is largely based on numbers, as you all have learned throughout the discussion on this chapter. Most of the decisions in American government are. A few pictures in the book for you. Republicans took control of the Senate in 2014, led by Mitch McConnell, a Republican out of Kentucky, and Charles Schumer is a Democrat out of New York. Okay, so these are some of the leaders in Congress today, in the Senate specifically. How much will the government spend? Well, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? The government spends a lot of money. Put very simply, their function is to prepare the budget for review of the executive branch. That'll be sent to the president. The OMB is an executive office, and they've been around since 1970, the Office of Management and Budget. Okay, the election year budget is typically different than other budgets that are written, and presidents will generally withdraw their support of any budget, especially when they are exiting office. And there's a discussion in that on your book, I believe, as well. So when we look at how a budget is made, and you may have read over the domestic policy chapter, which talks about budgeting here in the United States, it is a process. It starts with the executive committee or the executive agency requesting the budget. The OMB then gets approval from the OMB and the president. It is submitted to Congress. It is resolved on May 15th and October the 1st, beginning on the fiscal year of October 1. Outlays and obligations, October 1 to September 30th, obviously, of the following year, and then is audited after that. Okay, based on the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, because we all love our acronyms, don't we? Congress faces the budget. Well, basically, they have to appropriate and authorize how money is spent in this country. Tax dollars. Government revenue. The number one source of government revenue is tax dollars. These people decide how the money is spent. That's why they're important. They legislate the budget. They approve it. They find out what is important and what is not. And we try to avoid earmarks as much as possible. And another term for that is pork barrel spending as well. Basically non-essential spending that a lot of times the government will do. But I do want to show you all a video here, but I'm going to send the link to the class for everyone to look at as I wrap up today's presentation and things that we've discussed so far. Budget resolutions and crises. The continuing resolution, again, each year, this is something that Congress has to do and evaluate mistakes and things that have been made so they're not made in the future, and also things that have worked. So this is done by coming up with a budget every year, and we've been talking about it. We've been talking about the budget resolution. We discussed it a little bit earlier, and some things that I did want to bring to your attention. The federal debt ceiling. It's important to remember that there's a difference between the annual budget deficit and the cumulative federal debt. The book goes into a very large discussion on that. However, there are some examples that are pointed out here in 2011 and 2013. 2011, House Republicans tried to use it as a tool to accept spending cuts, and by that I mean use the debt ceiling as a tool. Again, Republicans did it in 2013. And ultimately, the Democrats did refuse to negotiate. This is when you had all the, you know, the fiscal cliff, and the other word that they came up with was the sequester or the sequestration. And this is what happens when there's basically not any agreement on the spending procedure and the expenditures and how they're going to go forward in Congress. This is a really interesting website that I wanted to show everyone with regard to the discussion that we were having on the federal debt. If you look at the total U.S. national debt, it's well over $20 trillion, which means that you and I both owe around $62,000, a little over $62,000 per citizen, equivalent to $169,000 per taxpayer. What we are effectively doing is spending ourselves into oblivion. When you compare this to the actual tax revenue that we are taking in, the numbers are extremely disproportionate. We're almost taking in or spending 7 times as much as we're taking in. Okay, so those numbers are very important to consider when we're looking at spending and we're looking at how much money are we actually taking in as a country versus how much we're spending. And if you look at the rest of the website, gives you a lot of different indicators, what we like to call in statistics. But the main thing I wanted to focus your attention on here today was at the end of our discussion here was the U.S. national debt, or the federal debt, and how much we have to compare that with our federal tax revenue. I hope that everyone's enjoyed this discussion today and that you've learned something from Chapter 11, our discussion on the Congress. As always, good luck to you in your studies. Enjoy what it is that you're doing right now and this part of life you're in, you're learning. It's a great time to be alive. And again, any questions or comments that you have, please let me know. I'm here for you. I'm here to support you. I hope you all have a great day, a good weekend. Bye-bye now.